The ordinary ride. It was a brisk autumn morning, and the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Commuters crowded the subway platforms, their faces a mosaic of weariness and quiet determination. Among them sat Liam Carver, a man whose presence could easily blend into any crowd. His worn leather jacket and faded jeans hinted at a life spent moving, though his sharp eyes, hidden under the brim of a plain baseball cap, told a different story. He was used to observing, not participating, a habit honed over years of necessity. Liam took a seat at the corner of the subway car, the seat closest to the window. He preferred it this way, where he could see everyone but remain unseen himself. The train rattled along the tracks, its rhythmic clatter providing a white noise that muffled the conversations around him. Today was supposed to be uneventful, just another ride, another trip through the bustling heart of the city. Liam closed his eyes, letting the gentle sway of the train lull him into a rare moment of calm. But fate had other plans. At the next stop, the doors slid open with a metallic hiss, and a wave of passengers shuffled in. Among them was an elderly woman clutching a large handbag, her fragile frame dwarfed by the bustling crowd. She moved slowly, her steps deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of decades. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her face bore the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the world change in ways most could never imagine. Liam's gaze flicked to her briefly before returning to the window. He noticed the way she scanned the car, looking for a seat. Her expression was patient, yet it carried a subtle plea, a silent hope that someone might offer her a spot. No one did. Most passengers were engrossed in their phones, heads down, as though the scene didn't exist. Liam felt a twinge of frustration, but stayed where he was, observing. Then he saw him. A wiry young man in a gray hoodie had entered the car just moments after the elderly woman. His movements were jittery, his eyes darting from side to side. He was like a predator, scanning for weakness. Liam had seen this type before, a hustler, someone always looking for an easy mark. The man's gaze landed on the elderly woman, and his lips curled into a smirk. Liam's stomach churned. He knew where this was heading. The young man stepped forward, blocking the woman's path. At first, Liam thought he might offer her his seat, but then the man's posture changed, his body language aggressive. "Move it, Grandma," the man barked, his voice sharp and cutting through the murmurs of the car. The woman froze, startled by the venom in his tone. She hesitated, unsure of how to respond, and then tried to step around him. But the man moved too, deliberately blocking her path again. "I said move," he repeated, this time with a sneer. His hand reached out, giving her a light shove. She stumbled slightly, catching herself on a nearby pole. The atmosphere in the car shifted instantly. Gasps rippled through the passengers, but no one moved. Heads turned, but as quickly as they did, they turned away, their owners retreating back into their digital cocoons or staring blankly out the windows. The social contract had been broken, and no one wanted to be the one to step forward to fix it. Liam's jaw tightened, his hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. He glanced around the car, his sharp eyes scanning the passengers. There were at least 20 people in the car, businessmen in suits, teenagers with backpacks, a mother holding her toddler, and yet not one of them stood up. The young man leaned in closer to the woman, his smirk widening as he grabbed the strap of her handbag. "What's in here, huh? Bricks? You hauling your life savings or something?" he taunted, shaking the bag slightly. "Please," the woman said, her voice trembling. "That's mine. Leave it be." Her words only seemed to encourage him. With a laugh, the man yanked the bag out of her hands and held it above her head, shaking it as though it were a toy. Tension rippled through the car. A few passengers pulled out their phones, not to call for help, but to record the scene. Some even chuckled nervously, as if laughing could absolve them of the guilt of doing nothing. Liam's patience snapped. In a fluid motion, he stood up, his figure towering over the seated passengers. The train swayed slightly, but his stance was steady, like a storm about to break. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots echoing against the metal floor. The young man, too caught up in his act of bravado, didn't notice at first. "Enough," Liam said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The young man froze mid-laugh, his head snapping around to face Liam. His cocky grin faltered as he took in the sight of the older man standing before him, eyes sharp as steel and unyielding as granite. "What you say, old man?" The young man sneered, though there was a hint of unease in his voice. "You think you're gonna play hero or something?" Liam didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step closer, closing the distance between them. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, steady, and full of authority. "Put it down," Liam said, his gaze locked onto the young man like a predator sizing up its prey. The subway car fell silent. Even the hum of the tracks seemed to fade as every passenger held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The weight of action. The subway car was a pressure cooker. The silence was thick, suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel tracks. All eyes were locked on Liam Carver and the wiry man in the gray hoodie, who stood frozen in a strange, electric standoff. Liam's presence was commanding, imposing, but not loud. His weathered face, framed by the brim of his cap, was a portrait of controlled fury. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. He didn't need to. It was in his stance, the way he carried himself like a man who had seen storms and learned to bend but never break. The young man licked his lips, his bravado cracking as his jittery eyes darted around the car. He was looking for an ally, an escape, anything to tip the balance back in his favor. The passengers who had laughed nervously before now shrank into their seats, their phones trembling in their hands. Nobody wanted to be a part of this, yet nobody could look away. "Hey man," the young man started, raising his free hand in mock surrender. His other hand still gripped the elderly woman's bag tightly, as if it were a lifeline. "Relax, all right. We're just messing around. No harm, no foul." "No harm." Liam's voice was quiet, steady, but it carried the force of a sledgehammer. He took another step forward, his boots thudding against the floor. "You think pushing an old lady around is harmless. You think snatching her bag is just a joke." The young man blinked rapidly, his bravado shrinking with each word. I didn't mean nothing by it. She's fine. Right, lady? You're fine." He glanced toward the elderly woman, who was clutching the pole for support, her frail hands trembling. She didn't reply, her wide, tear-filled eyes fixed on Liam. "Drop the bag," Liam repeated, his tone firm, leaving no room for negotiation. The young man hesitated, his knuckles whitening around the strap. The crowd's attention was a tangible weight pressing down on him. The pressure made him reckless. He sneered, trying to reclaim his fading dominance. "What are you gonna do, Grandpa? You want the bag. Come take it." Liam tilted his head slightly, a wolfish glint in his eyes. "You don't want to see where that road leads, kid." The train jolted as it sped through a curve, the sudden shift throwing everyone slightly off balance. The young man stumbled but quickly regained his footing, his grip on the bag loosening for just a second. That second was all Liam needed. In a blur of motion, Liam closed the gap between them. His hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist with a vice-like hold. The young man yelped in surprise, his bravado vanishing completely. Liam twisted his wrist just enough to make it uncomfortable, his other hand smoothly pulling the bag free. "That's enough," Liam said, his voice like iron. The young man recoiled, clutching his wrist. "You're crazy, man," he spat, his voice high-pitched and shaky. "You don't know who you're messing with." "No," Liam replied, stepping back and handing the bag to its rightful owner. "You don't." The elderly woman's eyes were wide with a mix of relief and gratitude as she took the bag, hugging it tightly to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice quivering. Liam nodded once, his eyes never leaving the young man. "Sit down," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young man hesitated, looking around the car for support, but none came. The passengers, who had been silent spectators, now wore expressions of quiet awe. Some nodded in approval, while others averted their gazes, embarrassed by their earlier inaction. "I said sit," Liam repeated, his voice dropping an octave. This time, the young man obeyed, sinking into the nearest seat with a defeated scowl. He muttered something under his breath, but Liam didn't care to listen. The man had been defanged, his ego stripped bare for all to see. The train's intercom crackled to life, announcing the next stop. The passengers stirred slightly, some preparing to disembark. Liam stayed standing, his arms crossed, his presence a silent reminder that justice had been served. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Who was this man? Why had he acted when no one else did? The elderly woman sat down gingerly, her hand still clutching the bag like a lifeline. She looked up at Liam, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "But I'm so glad you did." Liam gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. Someone had to. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a hiss. A few passengers shuffled out, their faces a mixture of shame and relief. One man, a businessman with a pristine suit and polished shoes, hesitated at the door. He turned back, meeting Liam's gaze briefly. "That was brave," he said awkwardly, before stepping onto the platform and disappearing into the crowd. The doors closed, and the train lurched forward again, plunging into the dimly lit tunnel. The atmosphere in the car was different now, lighter, yet charged with a lingering tension. The passengers who remained avoided Liam's gaze, their earlier complacency now a source of visible discomfort. The young man in the hoodie shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't dare look up, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Liam didn't sit down. He stood near the pole, one hand resting lightly on it for balance. His sharp eyes scanned the car, making it clear that he wasn't done watching. The elderly woman spoke again, her voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there before. "You remind me of someone," she said, tilting her head slightly. "My husband, God rest his soul. He wouldn't have stood for this either." Liam glanced at her, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "He sounds like a good man." She nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. He was. The train sped on, its rhythmic clatter filling the space between them. Liam leaned back slightly, his stance relaxing, but his mind remained sharp. He didn't know what waited at the next stop, but for now, this car was safe. For now, he had done what needed to be done. The turning tide. The train car settled into an uneasy quiet as it barreled through the underground tunnel. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting a staccato glow over the passengers. Though the confrontation was over, the aftermath hung heavy in the air, like the faint metallic tang of the subway itself. Liam Carver leaned against the pole, his eyes scanning the car like a sentinel, while the young man in the hoodie sat sulking in his seat, his head low and hands stuffed into his pockets. The elderly woman sat nearby, clutching her handbag as though letting go of it would shatter her fragile sense of safety. Her hands trembled less now, though her breaths came in uneven rhythm. Across the aisle, a teenage girl held her phone in her lap, her screen glowing faintly as she typed furiously. Liam's sharp eyes caught glimpses of words: subway hero, crazy guy, and video. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Next stop, Union Terminal. The intercom crackled. The robotic announcement brought a ripple of movement as passengers glanced toward the doors, readying themselves to exit. Liam remained still, his weight evenly distributed against the pole. He wasn't done. Not yet. The young man in the hoodie shifted uncomfortably. His earlier defiance had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that radiated from him in waves. His knee bounced rhythmically, and his eyes darted around the car, landing everywhere except on Liam. "You've got a lot of guts, standing up like that," a voice murmured. Liam turned his head slightly, meeting the gaze of a middle-aged man in a plaid shirt seated nearby. The man's expression was tentative, a mix of admiration and unease. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." "Most people should," Liam replied simply, his voice calm but firm. He didn't say it to accuse, but the words landed heavily all the same. The man nodded, looking away. At the far end of the car, a pair of young men whispered to each other, stealing glances at Liam. One of them held his phone aloft, angling it toward Liam's direction. The faint click of a camera shutter reached Liam's ears, subtle but unmistakable. He turned his head sharply, his expression hardening. "Put it away," Liam said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The young man froze, his phone halfway to his lap. "I wasn't." "Put it away," Liam repeated, cutting him off. The man's friend nudged him, and he quickly complied, shoving the phone into his jacket pocket. The interaction drew the attention of other passengers, who now seemed to sit up a little straighter. There was something about Liam, an air of authority that demanded respect, or perhaps fear. It wasn't just his stature or his voice. It was the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen and endured more than most could imagine. The train screeched as it began to slow, the lights inside flickering in sync with the brake's shrill whine. The motion jolted the passengers slightly forward, and the tension in the car shifted as the doors slid open with a hiss. Union Terminal was a bustling station, its platform lined with people waiting to board. A rush of cold air swept into the car, carrying with it the muffled sounds of the city above. Several passengers disembarked quickly, their heads down and strides brisk, as if eager to leave the tension behind. Among them was the middle-aged man who had spoken to Liam. He paused briefly before stepping out, meeting Liam's eyes one last time. "Take care, man," he said, his voice low. Liam gave a single nod in return. The man hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the crowd. New passengers filed in, their chatter and movement bringing a brief, fleeting sense of normalcy to the car. But the tension lingered, an invisible thread connecting the old woman, the young man in the hoodie, and Liam himself. It was as if the car remembered what had just transpired, and it refused to let anyone forget. The young man in the hoodie seemed to shrink further into his seat as the newcomers took notice of him. Whispers spread like wildfire, subtle but insistent. A woman in a business suit furrowed her brow as she glanced between the elderly woman and the young man, piecing together the aftermath of something she hadn't witnessed. A teenage boy in oversized headphones leaned over to his friend, murmuring something while pointing discreetly at Liam. Liam didn't need to hear the words to know their meaning. He had seen it all before: the fascination, the speculation, the inevitable spread of half-truths and assumptions. He closed his eyes briefly, trying to block it out, but his mind refused to quiet. The elderly woman broke the silence between them, her voice soft but resolute. "You didn't just help me, you know," she said, her eyes meeting Liam's. Liam tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to continue. "You showed them what it means to stand up," she added, nodding toward the other passengers. "It's easy to sit back and watch, harder to do what you did." "I just did what anyone should," Liam replied, his tone neutral. "That's just it," the woman said, her lips curving into a faint, bittersweet smile. "Not everyone does." Her words hung in the air, carrying a weight that seemed to settle on every passenger in the car. Even the newcomers, who hadn't witnessed the initial confrontation, seemed to feel it. The chatter quieted, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The young man in the hoodie finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. "Look, I didn't mean to hurt anyone, all right? It wasn't that serious." Liam turned to him slowly, his expression unreadable. "You pushed an old woman and took her bag. How is that not serious?" The young man flinched but quickly recovered, his defiance flickering back to life. "I was just messing around. People like her, they don't even notice half the time." "People like her." Liam's voice was sharp now, slicing through the car's hushed atmosphere. What does that mean? People who are older, weaker, easier to target. The young man's mouth opened, but no words came out. He shifted uncomfortably, his bravado collapsing under Liam's piercing gaze. You think that makes you strong. Liam pressed on, his voice low and deliberate. It doesn't. It makes you a coward. The young man slumped back in his seat, his face flushed with shame. He muttered something inaudible, but Liam didn't press further. The damage was done, and the lesson, he hoped, was delivered. The train jerked as it began to slow for the next station. Liam straightened, his eyes scanning the car one last time. He could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, their unspoken gratitude mingled with a newfound respect. For the elderly woman, for themselves, perhaps even for him. The intercom crackled again, announcing the stop. As the train doors slid open, the world outside seemed brighter, more vibrant. Liam glanced at the elderly woman, who smiled at him with a warmth that spoke louder than words. You take care now, she said, her voice steady. You too, Liam replied, tipping the brim of his cap. As the doors closed behind him, the subway car continued on its path, carrying its passengers forward, but not unchanged. The confrontation was over, but the echoes of it lingered, a reminder that courage, however rare, could ripple through even the most ordinary of places. Ripples in still water. The doors slid closed with a whisper of steel, and the subway rattled forward into the darkness of the tunnel. The tension in the car had dissipated somewhat, but the memory of what had just happened lingered, heavy and unspoken. Liam Carver was gone now, leaving the passengers to fill the void he'd left behind. For a moment, silence ruled, until the whispers began again. I can't believe he did that, a young woman murmured to the man next to her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. Who was he, though? Her companion replied. He didn't look like anyone special. Does it matter? The elderly woman interjected softly, her voice cutting through the hushed conversation. Her hands rested atop her bag now, her grip no longer desperate but steady, as if reclaiming control over more than just her belongings. He didn't need to be special to do what was right. The young woman blushed, muttering an apology, but the elderly woman shook her head, a faint smile on her face. Don't apologize, dear. Just remember what you saw. The rest of the passengers avoided eye contact, many choosing to scroll through their phones or stare out the window. But the older woman's words stayed with them, hanging in the air like a question they didn't know how to answer. At the far end of the car, the young man in the hoodie sat rigid, his eyes fixed on his shoes. He felt every gaze that lingered on him, every whispered judgment. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of his own actions. He shifted in his seat, glancing toward the elderly woman, but her focus remained elsewhere, her expression calm yet resolute. The train jolted slightly as it took a curve, the fluorescent lights flickering once more. The young man couldn't stand it any longer. He cleared his throat, his voice rough and uncertain. Look, I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand, all right. I was just... He trailed off, his words faltering. The elderly woman turned to him slowly, her gaze piercing but not unkind. You were just what? She asked, her tone even. I don't know. He burst out, running a hand through his messy hair. I was just angry, I guess. Everything's been a mess lately. I wasn't trying to hurt you, I swear. Her eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. Angry at what? Life? The world? And you thought that gave you the right to take it out on me. The young man flinched, the weight of her words sinking into him. He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. Instead, he slumped further into his seat, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Anger's a powerful thing, the elderly woman continued, her voice quieter now. It can eat you alive if you let it, but there's no excuse for what you did. The young man nodded silently, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue, to justify himself, but he couldn't. Not after the way Liam had stared him down. Not after hearing the murmurs and whispers from the passengers who had seen everything. A man sitting nearby leaned forward, his face serious but not accusatory. "Kid," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "you messed up. Big time. But it doesn't have to define you. What matters is what you do next." The young man glanced up at him, startled. "What I do next?" he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "Yeah," the man replied, sitting back in his seat. "We all screw up. What makes us better, or worse, is what we choose to do after." For the first time since the confrontation, the young man sat still, his bouncing knee coming to a halt. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes had shifted, less defiance, more contemplation. The train began to slow again, the screech of brakes signaling another stop. The passengers stirred, some gathering their belongings, others glancing toward the doors. The elderly woman remained seated, her posture straight, and her expression serene. The young man watched her for a moment before standing up suddenly. "Hey," he said awkwardly, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. The woman looked up at him, her brows slightly raised. "I'm sorry. For what I did. It was wrong. I know that now." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her gaze remained steady. "Do better," she said simply. He nodded, then turned and walked toward the doors. The train came to a halt, and he stepped off, disappearing into the bustling platform. For a moment, the passengers who remained sat in stunned silence, processing what had just occurred. The train started moving again, and the elderly woman finally relaxed into her seat. She glanced around the car, meeting the eyes of those who dared to look at her. "We're all responsible," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. "For each other. For this world. Never forget that." Her words resonated, a quiet truth that settled into the hearts of those who heard them. The train rattled on, its destination uncertain, but its passengers forever changed. Echoes of resolve. The subway car rumbled forward into the depths of the tunnel, its rhythmic clatter a constant companion. The atmosphere inside had shifted once more, from tension to reflection. Those who remained were no longer simply passengers. They were witnesses, participants in a moment that had revealed something raw and undeniable about humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. The elderly woman leaned back in her seat, her handbag resting firmly on her lap. Her hands were steady now, her breath even, but her eyes carried the weight of what had transpired. She gazed out of the window, though the darkness beyond offered no solace. Her thoughts were elsewhere, lingering on the man who had stepped up when no one else would. Liam Carver's presence had been a force of nature, and though he was gone, the echoes of his actions remained, rippling through the car like silent waves. The passengers felt it, an unspoken shift in the dynamics of their shared space. Some fidgeted uncomfortably, while others sat still, lost in thought. At the far end of the car, a young woman with earbuds dangling from her ears finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear. "Did anyone get his name?" she asked, glancing around nervously. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The elderly woman turned to her, offering a faint smile. "He didn't need to give it," she said softly. "What he did speaks for itself." The young woman nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. She looked down at her phone, where a video she had recorded of the confrontation played on loop. Her thumb hovered over the upload button, but she hesitated. Something about sharing the moment felt wrong, as if it would cheapen the rawness of what she had witnessed. A man in his late 40s, sitting across from her, leaned forward. He wore a navy suit that looked a little too crisp, his tie slightly askew. His eyes were thoughtful, his voice calm. "It's rare to see someone step in like that," he said. "Most of us, we just freeze, I guess. Or look away." Another passenger muttered, a middle-aged woman clutching a canvas tote bag. Her tone carried a trace of guilt, her gaze fixed on the floor. The suited man nodded. Yeah, but he didn't. He reminded us. He paused, searching for the right words. He reminded us what it looks like to stand up for someone. The elderly woman's faint smile grew, lines of wisdom etching her face like a map of resilience. He reminded us, she said, her voice steady, that fear is a choice, and so is courage. Her words resonated, sinking into the quiet hum of the car. A teenager sitting a few rows away, his backpack slouched on the floor, glanced up. His face was youthful, but his eyes carried a flicker of understanding. He had been silent during the confrontation, too paralyzed by indecision to act. Now he felt a gnawing regret that he couldn't quite shake. "I should have done something," he blurted out suddenly, his voice startling everyone. "When that guy was messing with her, I should have gotten up." The elderly woman turned toward him, her expression gentle but firm. "What matters now," she said, "is what you'll do next time." Her words settled over the boy like a weight and a promise. He nodded, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer now. "Next time." The train began to slow, the screech of brakes breaking the introspection. The intercom crackled, announcing the next stop, Franklin Cross. A few passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, their faces marked with a mix of relief and unease. As the train came to a halt, the doors slid open, letting in a rush of cold air and the distant murmur of the city above. Two police officers stepped onto the car, their crisp uniforms and purposeful strides commanding attention. Their eyes swept over the passengers, quickly landing on the elderly woman. One of them approached her, his expression professional but kind. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "are you all right? We received a report about an incident on this train." The woman straightened, her hands still resting atop her bag. "I'm fine now, thanks to a man who isn't here anymore," she replied. Her tone carried both gratitude and a quiet defiance, as if daring the world to challenge her strength. The officer nodded, glancing around the car. "We'll need statements from anyone who witnessed what happened," he said, pulling out a small notepad. The passengers exchanged uncertain glances, but one by one, they began to speak up. The suited man described the confrontation, his voice steady, but tinged with awe. The young woman with the phone hesitated, then offered her recording to the officers. Even the teenager with the backpack chimed in, his words halting but heartfelt. As the officers gathered the accounts, the mood in the car began to shift once more. What had been a moment of fear and paralysis was now a collective acknowledgement of something greater. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were part of a story, one that carried lessons about courage, responsibility, and the power of a single act. The elderly woman watched it all unfold, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. She thought of Liam Carver, the man who had stepped in when no one else would. She wondered where he was now, whether he realized the impact he had left behind. As the train doors closed and it moved forward again, the passengers sat a little straighter, their gazes less averted. The echoes of what had happened still lingered, but they no longer felt like ghosts. They felt like reminders of the courage they had witnessed and the courage they might one day find within themselves. For now, the train carried them onward, each of them changed in ways they couldn't yet articulate. And somewhere, out in the sprawling expanse of the city, Liam Carver walked among the crowds, his actions already rippling through lives he would never know. Ripples of resolve. As the train rumbled forward, the elderly woman's eyes lingered on the officers. They continued gathering details, moving through the car with professional precision. Passengers who had been silent before now found their voices, recounting the bravery of the man who had stood against cruelty. A young mother seated near the doors spoke softly, her voice carrying a note of admiration. "I don't know his name," she said, bouncing a restless toddler on her lap. "But the way he stepped in, he didn't hesitate. Not for a second." The officer nodded, jotting down her words. "Did anyone notice where he went?" he asked, his pen poised above the page. "No," the suited man replied, adjusting his tie. But he didn't look like someone who wanted attention. He just did what needed to be done. The officer looked up, his eyes scanning the car thoughtfully. "People like that don't come around often," he said, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "But it's good to know they're out there." The elderly woman smiled faintly. "Oh, they're out there," she said. "You just don't always see them until it matters." The officer met her gaze, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. "You've got a good point, ma'am." As the officers moved toward the next car to continue their investigation, the passengers settled back into their seats, the collective tension easing further. But the conversations didn't stop. It was as if Liam's actions had unlocked something within them, a desire to speak, to connect, to process what they had witnessed. The teenager with the backpack leaned forward, addressing the elderly woman hesitantly. "Do you think the guy who helped you, do you think he's like a cop or something?" She shook her head, her silver hair catching the flickering light. "No," she said simply. "He didn't act like one. He acted like a man who's lived enough to know what's worth fighting for." The teenager frowned, considering her words. "I wish I could be like that," he muttered. "You can," she replied, her tone firm but kind. "You already are in here." She tapped her chest lightly. "It's just a matter of letting it out when the time comes." The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful. He sat back, staring out the window at the streaking lights of the tunnel. Her words felt heavy in his mind, like a key unlocking something he hadn't realized was there. Meanwhile, the young woman with the phone stared down at her screen. The video she had recorded showed Liam standing firm, his presence commanding yet unassuming. She watched it again, replaying the moment when he had stepped between the elderly woman and her aggressor. Her thumb hovered over the post button once more, but she hesitated again. The elderly woman noticed her deliberation and leaned slightly toward her. "Thinking of sharing that, are you?" The young woman looked up, startled. Yeah, I was. I mean, people should see what happened, right? They should know what he did." The elderly woman considered this for a moment, her gaze steady. "That's true," she said finally. "But make sure you're sharing the right story." "What do you mean?" the young woman asked, confused. "Don't turn it into a spectacle," the elderly woman replied. "What he did wasn't about fame or attention. It was about doing what's right, even when no one else would. If you share it, make sure people understand that." The young woman nodded slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed a caption for the video. When she finished, she hit post and set her phone aside, exhaling deeply. She looked back at the elderly woman, who offered her a small, approving smile. The train began to slow once more, its brakes squealing as it approached the next station. The robotic announcement crackled over the intercom, ninging the stop, and the doors hissed open to let in another rush of cold air. A new group of passengers stepped aboard, their faces indifferent to the charged atmosphere they were entering. Among them was a man in a well-worn trench coat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He paused for a moment, scanning the car before taking a seat near the elderly woman. She glanced at him briefly, her sharp eyes catching something familiar in his posture, a quiet strength, a calm that belied a history of action. But this man was not Liam Carver. He was just another face in the crowd. As the train moved forward again, the conversations among the remaining passengers continued, quieter now, but no less meaningful. The ripples of Liam's courage were spreading, changing the dynamic of the car in subtle but profound ways. The elderly woman sat back, her fingers tracing the worn leather of her handbag. She felt safe now, not just because of Liam's intervention, but because of the lesson he had left behind. A reminder that bravery wasn't about who you were but about what you chose to do. And as the subway hurtled through the darkness, carrying its passengers toward their destinations, it carried with it the echoes of a moment that none of them would soon forget. The legacy in motion. The train slid into the next station, its brakes releasing a high-pitched whine as it slowed. The doors hissed open, and another wave of passengers filed in, oblivious to the undercurrent of significance that had permeated the car. Those who remained from earlier, the ones who had witnessed courage in its rawest form, watched the newcomers with a kind of quiet reverence, as if carrying the secret they weren't ready to share. The elderly woman adjusted her handbag, her movements deliberate as she shifted slightly in her seat. She glanced around at the faces of those who remained, searching for something. Not judgment or pity, but a spark of understanding. A recognition that they had all been changed by what had happened. She found it in the teenage boy with the slouched backpack, the young woman with her phone, and even the suited man who now sat straighter, his tie finally adjusted properly. Across the car, the young woman with the phone scrolled through her feed. Her post was already gaining traction, likes, shares, and comments flooding in faster than she could read. Most praised Liam's courage, while others questioned the bystanders' hesitation. The discourse was ignited, but the young woman couldn't shake the feeling that something about it felt incomplete. He wouldn't have wanted this, she muttered to herself. "What's that, dear?" the elderly woman asked, her keen ears catching the remark. The young woman hesitated, then turned her phone toward her, showing her the post. The video was crisp, capturing every detail of Liam's decisive intervention. The caption read, "Real hero on the subway today. Reminds us all to be better." Beneath it, comments poured in. "This guy deserves a medal. Why didn't anyone else step in? We need more people like him in this world." The elderly woman studied the screen for a moment before handing the phone back with a faint smile. "You're right," she said. "He wouldn't have wanted this. But maybe it's not about him. Maybe it's about what he left behind." The young woman frowned, uncertain. "What do you mean?" The elderly woman leaned forward slightly, her voice low but full of conviction. "A single act of courage can ripple out further than you'll ever know. It's not about the recognition. It's about what people do with the memory of it. If that video reminds someone to stand up next time, then it's worth it." The young woman nodded slowly, her fingers hovering over the screen. Instead of deleting the post, she added another comment beneath it. "Let this remind us to step up when it counts. Don't just watch. Act." The train jolted forward, plunging once more into the dimly lit tunnel. The rumble of its movement filled the silence, but there was a new energy in the car now, one that hadn't been there before. It was as though Liam's presence lingered, a shadow of his resolve etched into the space he had occupied. The teenage boy with the backpack glanced toward the elderly woman, his face conflicted. "Do you think he'll ever know how much he did?" he asked. She met his gaze, her expression softening. "Maybe not, but that's not why he did it." "Then why?" the boy pressed, his curiosity earnest. She thought for a moment, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag. "Because he could. Because in that moment, he understood something the rest of us forgot. It's not about waiting for someone else to step up. It's about choosing to." The boy nodded, her words sinking in. He shifted in his seat, his posture less slouched, as if trying to embody the lesson she had just imparted. As the train continued its journey, the passengers who had witnessed the confrontation began to talk amongst themselves. Their conversations were quiet at first, hesitant, but they grew bolder with time. Strangers shared their thoughts, their fears, and their newfound sense of responsibility. The space that had once been defined by apathy and detachment now pulsed with connection. "I wonder where he is now," the suited man mused aloud, his voice carrying over the low hum of the train. "Does it matter?" the elderly woman replied with a knowing smile. "He's already here, in a way." Her words drew thoughtful looks from those around her. She wasn't speaking of Liam's physical presence, but of the impact he had left behind. The courage he had ignited, the change he had inspired. It was a legacy in motion, carried forward by those who had witnessed it. The train began to slow again, the screech of brakes signaling its approach to another station. This time, the elderly woman stood, her bag in hand and her shoulders squared. She moved toward the doors with the same deliberate grace she had shown earlier, but now there was a quiet strength in her stride. The teenager with the backpack called out to her just as the doors opened. "Ma'am, what's your name?" She paused, turning back with a gentle smile. "Call me Eleanor." "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. She nodded, stepping onto the platform. The doors closed behind her, and the train moved forward once more, carrying its passengers into the unknown. But the memory of what had happened stayed with them, a seed planted in their hearts, waiting to grow. Somewhere, in another part of the city, Liam Carver walked the streets unnoticed, his baseball cap pulled low. He blended into the crowd, just another face in the bustling chaos of urban life. He didn't know about the video, or the conversations still unfolding on that subway car. He didn't need to. He had done what he could, and that was enough. As the train rattled onward, its passengers carried with them the echoes of a moment that had reminded them of their own capacity for courage. And though they didn't know it yet, each of them had been changed, not by the man who had acted, but by the understanding that they could do the same. The train barreled through the darkness, its rhythmic clatter a backdrop to the subdued energy in the car. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation exchanged quiet words or thoughtful glances, each grappling with their own reflections. Liam Carver's departure had left an impression that was both profound and humbling. The teenager with the backpack, still leaning against his seat, glanced down at his hands. His fingers fidgeted with a loose thread, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene over and over. He remembered the anger on the young man's face, the fear in Eleanor's eyes, and most of all, the calm authority with which Liam had stepped in. A question gnawed at him. What would he have done if Liam hadn't been there? Would he have stood up, or would he have kept his head down, letting fear and doubt paralyze him? He clenched his fists, the thread snapping under the pressure. "Next time," he muttered to himself, echoing the promise he'd made earlier. "Next time, I'll be ready." The young woman with the phone sat quietly, scrolling through the flood of reactions to her post. Comments poured in faster than she could read, many of them praising Liam's bravery, while others asked the uncomfortable questions she had been grappling with herself. Why didn't anyone else act? Why do we always wait for someone else to do the right thing? Her gaze shifted to Eleanor, now gone but still vivid in her memory. The older woman's words resonated deeply. It's not about him. It's about what he left behind. She set her phone down, staring out at the blur of tunnel walls. For the first time, the thought crossed her mind. What am I leaving behind? The suited man adjusted his tie again, his mind occupied with similar thoughts. He had been one of the bystanders who did nothing, hiding behind the excuse of propriety and self-preservation. Now he felt the sting of regret. Liam's actions had exposed the fragility of that excuse, leaving him questioning the values he had built his life upon. The train slowed once more, its brakes screeching as it approached the next station. The intercom crackled, announcing the stop in its monotone voice. As the doors slid open, the passengers stirred, some standing to leave, others simply shifting in their seats. The teenager grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder, hesitating for a moment before stepping toward the doors. He paused, turning back to glance at the others who remained. "See you around," he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the train. The young woman with the phone offered him a small smile. "Take care," she replied. The teenager stepped onto the platform, the cool air rushing past him as he walked toward the exit. His posture was different now, straighter, more purposeful. He didn't know when he might face a moment like this again, but he felt ready for it in a way he hadn't before. The train doors slid closed, and the car rattled forward once more. The passengers who remained fell silent again, each retreating into their thoughts. The suited man watched the lights flicker overhead, his hand resting on his briefcase. He didn't know how, but he felt certain that the next time he was faced with a choice, he wouldn't look away. Far above the underground tracks, Liam Carver walked the crowded streets, his hands shoved into the pockets of his leather jacket. The noise of the city surrounded him, Honking cars, snippets of conversations, the distant wail of a siren. But he was lost in his own thoughts. He hadn't stayed to see the aftermath of his actions. He didn't need to. He stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. A nearby newsstand caught his eye, the headlines shouting from the covers, "Subway Hero Stuns New York." He knew they weren't talking about him directly. He had avoided cameras, slipped away before the police could ask questions. But the sentiment was unmistakable. The light changed, and Liam crossed the street, blending seamlessly into the crowd. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. The only thing that mattered to him was that he'd done the right thing. He hoped it had been enough. As he walked, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Somewhere, on that subway car, lives had been changed, not because of him, but because of what he reminded them they could be. Courage wasn't about grandeur or spectacle. It was about the simple act of standing up when it mattered most. Back on the train, Eleanor sat quietly, her hands resting on her handbag as the city blurred past the windows. She thought about Liam, about the strength he had shown, and the ripple effect it had created. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that his actions had not only protected her but inspired others. The train slowed for another station, and Eleanor stood, preparing to leave. As she stepped toward the doors, she glanced back at the remaining passengers. Her voice was calm but carried a quiet authority. "Don't forget what you saw today," she said, "because someday it might be you who has to make the choice." The doors slid open, and she stepped onto the platform, disappearing into the flow of commuters. The train moved forward again, carrying its passengers into the heart of the city, each of them carrying the weight of what they had witnessed and the promise of what they might become. In the vast, sprawling chaos of the metropolis, Liam Carver melted into the background, just another face in the crowd. But his actions lingered, a legacy carried forward by those who had been there to see it. And as the city roared on, a quiet truth echoed through its streets and subways. Courage is contagious.